He's hit the century mark, but if you sit down with Dick Van Dyke today, his mind goes straight back to the 1960s and straight to Mary. Decades after playing television's most iconic husband and wife, he hasn't stopped bringing up her name. The undeniable spark, the fits of laughter, and the line between acting and real emotion that got dangerously blurry. Here is the true story of what went down behind the scenes and why he waited so long to set the record straight. Two people, one legendary sitcom. Picture this. It's 1961. A relatively unknown 23-year-old actress named Mary Tyler Moore walks into a room to audition for a role opposite a lanky, rubber-limbed comedian named Dick Van Dyke. Van Dyke later recalled that she impressed everyone in the room right away. What nobody could have predicted yet was just how iconic that pairing was about to become. The Dick Van Dyke Show ran from 1961 to 1966 on CBS, and it turned both of them into household names practically overnight. Van Dyke played Rob Petrie, a slightly neurotic but lovable comedy writer. Moore played his wife, Laura Petrie, the woman who somehow made capri pants a cultural moment that's still being referenced in fashion circles today. Together, they weren't just funny. They were believable. That authenticity became one of the show's greatest strengths. At a time when television families often felt polished and predictable, Rob and Laura Petrie came across like two people you might actually know. They teased each other without cruelty, argued without melodrama, and celebrated ordinary moments with genuine warmth. Viewers weren't just watching a sitcom, they were watching a marriage that felt refreshingly human, which made the chemistry between Van Dyke and Moore even more convincing. Audiences actually bought that these two people loved each other, bickered like real spouses, and knew each other's rhythms down to the second, right down to the way they'd finish each other's sentences or land a punchline off a single glance across the living room set. That kind of chemistry doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't always stay confined to the script pages either. Anyone who's worked in television or film will tell you that spending 12, 14 hours a day pretending to be married to someone can blur lines that were never meant to blur. You laugh at the same jokes off camera that you're supposed to laugh at on camera. You start finishing each other's sentences for real, not just for the script. You develop shorthand, inside jokes, a rhythm that outsiders can't quite crack. For Van Dyke and Moore, something clearly clicked beyond the cameras, and he said as much himself, more than once, over the years, in a way that sounds far more like fond nostalgia than scandal. But here's where the story tends to get twisted into something it isn't. This was never some secret bombshell he kept locked away for 6 decades, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate it in a tell-all interview. Van Dyke has talked about his feelings for Moore in interviews and in his own writing going back years, long before certain headlines started framing it like a deathbed confession dragged out of an old man against his will. This is a man who has spent decades being open about his life, his struggles, and his relationships. So what actually was the story? And how far did it really go beyond a well-known crush? The giggle fits and the psychiatrist, here's the part people love to gossip about. And honestly, it's a pretty charming story once you strip away all the tabloid spin that's been layered on top of it over the years. Van Dyke has openly admitted that he developed a crush on Moore while they were filming the show together. Not a fling, not a secret hookup, a crush, the kind teenagers get. Except this one belonged to a grown man starring in one of the biggest sitcoms on television. Standing across from a co-star, he was supposed to be treating like a professional colleague and nothing more. According to Van Dyke's own account, the two of them would get fits of the giggles around each other on set, to the point where it became a running problem during filming. He's described it plainly. They simply could not stop laughing when they were together. Directors probably loved the chemistry and hated the delays in equal measure, because you can imagine how many takes got blown just because the two leads couldn't hold a straight face. If you've ever worked closely with someone you're a little too fond of, you already know exactly what that feels like. It's nervous energy dressed up as comedy, the kind of laughter that isn't really about the joke at all. It's about the person standing next to you. The detail that really sells the story, though, is the psychiatrist. Van Dyke has said that at some point, a psychiatrist essentially told him what should have been obvious to everyone watching from the outside. He had a crush on his co-star. Sometimes it takes someone with zero stake in the situation to say the quiet part out loud, because the two people in the middle of it are usually the last ones to admit what's happening. It's a small, almost funny anecdote, but it also tells you everything about how real those feelings were for him. This wasn't manufactured for publicity decades later. This was a genuine, complicated pull between two people who spent years playing pretend at being madly in love, 5 days a week, in front of a live studio audience, cameras rolling, cast and crew watching every take. There's also something worth noting about the timing of when Van Dyke has chosen to share this story over the years. It hasn't come out in some tell-all designed to shock people. It's come out gradually, in reflective interviews, in his own memoirs, in the kind of setting where an older man looks back on his life and decides which memories are worth passing along. That context matters. A story told that way, consistently, across different formats and different decades, tends to hold up a lot better than a single juicy quote pulled out of context and repackaged as a headline. Now, a crush is one thing. Acting on it is an entirely different question, and that's exactly where this story gets more complicated, and honestly, more human than most Hollywood gossip ever manages to be. Married to Other People, here's the detail that changes everything about how you should read this whole story. Both Van Dyke and Moore were married to other people for most of the years they spent playing husband and wife on television. That's not a footnote you can skip past on your way to the juicy part. That's the entire moral center of this whole situation. And it's the part every clickbait headline conveniently leaves out because it doesn't fit the scandal narrative they're trying to sell you. Van Dyke has been direct about this part too. He and Moore never pursued anything beyond friendship and mutual affection because they were both committed elsewhere. And by every account, both of them took that commitment seriously, even while the chemistry between them was obvious to anyone on set. Whatever spark existed between them, and by his own admission there clearly was one, it never crossed into an actual affair. No secret meetings after hours. No offset relationship hiding behind the cameras, waiting to be exposed by some tabloid photographer with a long lens. Just two people who liked each other. Maybe more than either of them ever expected walking into that audition room in 1961, and who chose not to act on it, year after year, season after season. That's honestly a more interesting story than the version where they secretly dated, isn't it? We're so used to celebrity gossip meaning scandal, meaning betrayal, meaning somebody eventually got hurt or humiliated in the press. So, if there was never a scandal, never an affair, never anything actually hidden here, why does this story keep resurfacing decade after decade, like it's brand new information nobody's ever heard before? Maybe because what happened between them was never really about romance at all. Maybe it was about something that outlasted romance entirely. What made their chemistry so unforgettable for millions of viewers? Rob and Laura Petrie didn't just look like a happily married couple. They felt like one. That's why people have spent decades wondering if there had to be something more happening once the cameras stopped rolling. Their timing was effortless. They anticipated each other's reactions before a line was even finished, and neither performer ever seemed like they were trying too hard. That kind of ease is incredibly difficult to fake, even for experienced actors, which is exactly why audiences kept believing there had to be a real-life love story hiding somewhere behind the scenes. Part of that magic came from trust. Van Dyke has often praised Moore's instincts as performer, saying she always knew exactly how to make a scene better without stealing attention from anyone else. She could match his physical comedy beat for beat, then turn around and ground the scene with genuine warmth. He, in turn, gave her the freedom to experiment and play. They weren't competing for laughs. They were building them together, and viewers could feel that every single week. Looking back now, it's easy to understand why people confused great chemistry with romance. But sometimes the strongest on-screen partnerships aren't built on secret relationships at all. They're built on mutual admiration, shared respect, and years of learning exactly how the other person thinks. That's what Rob and Laura Petrie became for television audiences. The gold standard for a believable married couple, not because of any hidden scandal, but because two remarkably gifted performers trusted each other completely. That trust didn't disappear when the series ended. If anything, it became the foundation for a friendship that lasted the rest of Mary Tyler Moore's life, proving that what they built together was far more enduring than any Hollywood rumor ever could. The Dick Van Dyke Show ended in 1966, But whatever existed between these two didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling for the final time. Their friendship carried on for the rest of Moore's life. That's the part of this story that gets lost every time people chase the crush angle for a punchy thumbnail. The real headline here isn't co-stars had feelings for each other. It's co-stars had feelings for each other, chose loyalty over temptation, and stayed close friends for the next 50 years anyway, long after anyone was still watching. That's genuinely rare in Hollywood. Plenty of on-screen couples can barely stand each other once the camera's cut for the final time and the wrap party ends. Plenty more burn bright during production and then never speak again once the show wraps and everybody moves on to the next project, the next contract, the next life. Van Dyke and Moore did the opposite. They built something that survived their separate marriages, survived major career shifts on both sides, survived decades of physical distance between projects, and survived the simple passage of time, which tends to erode more Hollywood friendships than any scandal ever could. Whatever chemistry got them through 5 seasons of live audience network television clearly wasn't just a performance for the cameras. It was the foundation of a genuine, lasting bond between two people who respected each other deeply, on and off the screen. Think about everything that separated them over those decades. Different marriages, different projects, different coasts, different phases of life, different chapters entirely. Friendships fall apart under far less pressure than that all the time, even between people who genuinely liked each other once. The fact that theirs didn't tells you this was never just workplace fondness that faded once the paychecks stopped coming. It was something both of them actively maintained, checked in on, and valued enough to keep alive across an entire lifetime. And that bond is exactly why, when the worst news eventually came, Van Dyke didn't respond like someone talking about a former co-worker he hadn't thought about in years. He responded like a man who had just lost someone who mattered to him for over half a century. So what did he actually say when Mary Tyler Moore passed away? And why did his words hit as hard as they did with fans who grew up watching the two of them together every week? Losing Mary. 2017. Mary Tyler Moore died in 2017, and Dick Van Dyke didn't stay quiet about it. He spoke publicly, and he didn't hold back on how much she meant to him, both personally and professionally. In an interview following her death, he described their chemistry, their friendship, and the legacy she left behind in television, speaking about her the way you'd expect someone to speak about a lifelong friend, not a colleague from 6 decades earlier who'd simply faded into memory. He called her the best, not one of the best, not just a great co-star, the best. He praised her comic timing specifically. And if you've ever watched even a single episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, you already know exactly why that word gets used so often to describe her. Moore had this ability to land a joke with nothing more than a look or a perfectly timed pause, and Van Dyke, who spent 5 years standing next to her doing exactly that kind of work, understood better than almost anyone alive just how rare that kind of talent actually was, and how hard it is to find a scene partner who matches it beat for beat, week after week, without ever missing. This wasn't a scripted tribute or a publicist-approved statement handed to him to read off a card at a memorial. This was a man in his 90s talking, unprompted, about someone he'd loved, in whatever complicated, undefined way that word actually applies here, for over 50 years. The crush from 1961 hadn't faded into some vague, distant memory tucked away in an old scrapbook somewhere. It had matured into genuine grief for a friend he'd known his entire adult life, from the moment they were both young and unknown to the moment she was gone for good. That 2017 interview wasn't the last time he'd bring her up either. Nearly a decade later, as he approached his own historic milestone, her name was still finding its way into his interviews, still part of how he talked about his career and his life whenever a journalist asked him to look back. So what's he been saying about her lately? Now that he's the one turning 100 years old and reflecting on a career 8 decades in the making? Dick Van Dyke turned 100 years old in December of 2025, and the milestone brought a wave of new interviews, tributes, and even a documentary celebrating a career that spanned nearly 8 decades. Theaters across the country screened a new film about his life to mark the occasion, and once again, Mary Tyler Moore's name kept surfacing throughout the coverage, because you genuinely cannot tell the story of Dick Van Dyke's career without her standing right there next to him, front and center in nearly every retrospective. He's continued reflecting on his life with the same candor he's always had, joking about his age, crediting his wife Arlene Silver for keeping him active and healthy, and looking back on a career that includes multiple Emmys, a Tony, and a Grammy. He even picked up a Daytime Emmy in recent years for a guest role, becoming one of the oldest winners in that award's history, a fact that says everything about a man who simply refuses to stop working even after 99 years of doing it. But ask anyone what defined that career. Ask any longtime fan or any entertainment journalist covering his 100th birthday celebrations, and the Dick Van Dyke Show comes up almost immediately. And so does she. This is really the point of this whole story. There was never a moment where Dick Van Dyke finally broke his silence about Mary Tyler Moore, because he was never actually silent about her to begin with. He talked about the crush. He talked about the giggling fits. He talked about her talent and her friendship, in interviews stretching from right after her passing all the way up through his own 100th birthday celebrations nearly a decade later. What's actually happening here isn't a secret, getting dramatically revealed after decades of silence. It's a man in his 100th year still choosing, freely and repeatedly, to honor someone who shaped the best years of his career, every single time he gets the chance to talk about her. So maybe the real question isn't what Dick Van Dyke has finally admitted about Mary Tyler Moore. Maybe it's why, after everything, after 60-plus years, he's never once stopped bringing her up. What this says about old Hollywood loyalty, there's something almost old-fashioned about this whole story that's worth pausing on, because it tells you something about the era these two came up in. This was the early 1960s. Television was still young. The people making these shows were often working alongside their spouses, their families, their entire social circles, in a much smaller industry than the sprawling entertainment machine we know today. There was less distance between your personal life and your professional life, and that meant less room to hide anything, even if you'd wanted to. Van Dyke and Moore weren't operating in some anonymous corner of a massive industry where nobody would notice if lines got crossed. They were the two biggest names on one of the most watched shows on American television, surrounded by crew members, producers, and a live audience every single week. If something had actually happened between them, the odds of it staying hidden for 60 years, through 2 rounds of interviews after Moore's passing and now through Van Dyke's own 100th birthday coverage, are basically non-existent. Secrets that big don't survive that kind of scrutiny for 6 decades. Small admissions of an old crush, on the other hand, absolutely can, because there was never anything to actually hide in the first place. What you're really looking at here is a snapshot of a certain kind of restraint that doesn't get talked about much anymore. 2 people felt something real for each other, in the middle of a job that required them to simulate romance for an audience every single day, and they simply chose their marriages instead, not because nobody would have found out, because it mattered to both of them to make that choice. That's not a scandal. That's arguably one of the more admirable things 2 co-stars have ever admitted to each other and to the public. And it's exactly why the friendship that came after didn't need to be complicated by guilt or regret. There was nothing to apologize for, nothing to hide, no messy fallout to manage for the rest of their lives. Just 2 people who liked each other enormously, respected the choices they both made, and got to enjoy each other's company as friends for decades afterward without any of that weight hanging over them. The legacy they built together, it's worth remembering just how influential the Dick Van Dyke Show actually was, because that context matters when you're talking about why this particular pairing still gets discussed 60-plus years later. The show is widely regarded as one of the sharpest, most influential sitcoms of its era, praised for its writing, its physical comedy, and for treating its characters like actual people instead of punchline machines. It set a template that countless workplace and family comedies would borrow from for decades afterward, and a huge part of that template was the believability of Rob and Laura Petrie as a couple.